I did wonder when this story was going to break the surface. Because this situation has been bubbling for years. And yes, I'm talking about the rivalry, the bad blood between Terence Crawford and Gary Russell Jr. Now, several years ago, I was talking to a Facebook friend of mine who's from the United States. There were several people from the United States I used to talk to on a regular basis on Facebook. And they were based out of Las Vegas. A couple of these guys were from Vegas and they were amateur boxers. And they, back then, told me that there had been some type of altercation between Gary Russell Jr. and Terence Crawford back in the days. And that Gary Russell Jr. had basically come out on top during that altercation. And given the fact that Gary Russell Jr. is much smaller than Terence Crawford, questions were asked about Terence Crawford. And I'm talking about on the grapevine, in the gyms, all that kind of stuff. There were whispers going around that Terence Crawford might be chinny because of this altercation he had with Gary Russell Jr. in a boxing gym or outside a boxing gym. They had some kind of scuffle. Now, I talked about this on my YouTube channel several times in multiple videos. Some of you guys may remember that I was always bringing up this rumor that Gary Russell Jr. had got the better of Terence Crawford in some kind of altercation back in the days. And people were always dismissing it and saying, oh, it's all nonsense. I'm sure it's just some made up stuff. Because whenever there's a rumor, a lot of people just automatically assume that it's not true. But in my experience on YouTube, most of the rumors that I hear about boxers and sparring or whatever the case may be, most of these things end up being true. Yes, some of them turn out to be complete fabrications, but the majority of them actually turn out to be true. So as the old adage goes, there's no smoke without fire. All right. And so it is also the case here. Terence Crawford and Gary Russell Jr. are now on social media, going at each other verbally and giving their account of what happened that day in the gym. And indeed, Gary Russell Jr. did, punch Terence Crawford in that altercation, but Terence Crawford has a very different version of it than Gary Russell Jr., as you would expect. Okay, Gary Russell Jr. is acting like he's the aggressor and Terence Crawford didn't want none of that smoke. But, Terence Crawford basically says that Gary Russell Jr. sucker punched him. He blindsided him. And, he says that he actually got, kicked out of the gym or kicked off the team after that incident? I can't remember. But Gary Russell Jr., another thing about him that I was told by Americans who, as I say, I used to chat to several years ago, who were based in Vegas and they were always in those Vegas gyms. They said that Gary Russell Jr. has a terrible attitude. I remember one of them said that Gary Russell Jr. came into their gym in Vegas for the first time, and the way the guy was carrying on, they said, nah, man, this guy has got a serious attitude problem. And I don't think it's much of a stretch to entertain the possibility that Gary Russell might be somebody suffering from Napoleon syndrome, little man syndrome, where because he's such a short guy, he feels like he has to overcompensate by being, brash and loud and maybe trying to come across as a bit of a bully. Yeah. I get the impression that Gary Russell might be a bit like that based upon not just the stuff he says on camera and the way he's been with Terence Crawford, but even stuff I've been told behind the scenes about people that have met him and seen him in the gym, that he's not the nicest guy you could ever come across according to them. So, as I say, only a matter of time, I thought, until this story broke the surface. It's taken several years, but finally we're here. Gary Russell Jr. is talking about stepping up to 147 to fight Terence Crawford. And, Terence Crawford's firing back and saying, you're a little man, you took a cheap shot, and now you're running with that, trying to clout chase and all this kind of business. Look, I think that Gary Russell Jr. genuinely believes that he could beat Terence Crawford in a fight. I think he genuinely believes that. Do I concur? No, I don't. I think Terence Crawford would outbox Gary Russell Jr. comprehensively. He might not stop him. Gary Russell Jr. is tough. I know he's much smaller than Terence Crawford, but Gary Russell Jr. is tough, and he's very, very fast, as we all know, with his hands. Gary Russell Jr., in retrospect, did very well to go the distance with Vasyl Lomachenko. I know Lomachenko probably wasn't peaking at the stage when he fought Gary Russell Jr., but still, if you consider all the people that Lomachenko has, stopped since then, and on top of that, Gary Russell wasn't peaking at the time when he fought Lomachenko. So as much as Lomachenko wasn't at his absolute peak, Gary Russell wasn't either. So he did well to go the distance, and that was one of Lomachenko's more competitive fights. Not that it was close in any way. I know the judges' scorecards, I think, were fairly close. It actually wasn't that close. It was a pretty comfortable victory for Lomachenko, but it was closer than a lot of other Lomachenko fights. He didn't manage to overwhelm Gary Russell the way that he overwhelms most fighters. So we do have to give Gary Russell credit for that. And I think it's testament to his toughness and his survival skills, and his offensive skills to some degree. So, yeah, that's the situation. Terence Crawford and Gary Russell Jr. The rumors turned out to be true, once again, that they had this altercation in the gym years ago. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below about this beef. Terence Crawford is a laid-back kind of character, okay? He's not up in your face and all that business, but he does come from a rough background, Terence Crawford. If you know his personal history, he's been through some stuff, some serious stuff. So a little beef with Gary Russell Jr., I don't think is going to disturb him that much, considering the things that he's been through in his life. So anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Some people are obviously backing Gary Russell and they're saying, yeah, you exposed Terence. And other people are saying, nah, man, Terence is telling the truth and Gary Russell hit him with a cheap shot. It has to be said, Terence Crawford at the time was something like 18. I think Gary Russell can't have been much older. So they were teenagers at the time. But, it is what it is. It's all water under the bridge. It's all fun and games. Let me know what you guys think about it. I'm Hammond. Excuse me. It's Hammond. I'm out.